it's time for Bring It In, Troop's little Zoom from Quarantine show. And look, it's been a year, really, sort of, kind of, since we started Bring It In. And it was sort of kind of Bring It In. We didn't get this name for another little bit, but our initial guest, Prim Siripipat, we're marking the occasion. Prim, thank you for coming back.
Thank you for having me. Not thank you for letting me go on air like that last year. I mean, I saw that video and I was like disheveled, sweat. I mean, I looked homeless. I was like sitting on my dog's bed on the floor in the bedroom in Manhattan. Henry, why'd you dude, we go way back. Why'd you let me go on air like that? You did me wrong.
Wrong times.
Judy, do you want to watch can we watch the little movie?
No!
Oh,
I don't want to see that.
Yes.
I thought it was
We were
great.
just dealing with it in our apartment building on Saturday night. The people down the hallway were having a party until 4 a.m, and people were running in and out, drinking, smoking, whatever else. And we live in the Upper West Side, which is generally like a very family-friendly neighborhood. And so to answer the question, unfortunately, I think it is going to be that demographic that they're really going to have to step up. And I don't know what we're going to have to do to help control some of that recklessness.
All right, that's good.
You nailed it, Prim. You nailed it.
I didn't nail any. The only thing I nailed was like sounding like a really old, bitter woman. I was like, listen to those people like partying till 4 a.m. and they're drinking and partying. There was nothing great about that. And also, even if I've been doing television or broadcasting for 17 years, it doesn't get any easier watching myself on anything. It's very cringeworthy. But thanks for that, Henry. And
you have high standards, though, to be honest. Like, I mean, I think that we've had a lot of guests, including your husband, on the show.
Wandering around the park with a laptop and your little child running around.
Family-friendly show. The only person you have yet to bring on is my dog and our son.
Oh, that's not entirely true.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
My dog then.
Yeah, that's true. There's time. We're gonna keep doing this. We can book them later.
So can you catch us up? At that time you were, I think, starting a PhD program, or were you already in it? What have you been doing since we last saw you?
Yeah, so that period, I remember the year starting off with Kobe and Gigi, and that whole helicopter plane crash. That was awful. And then the pandemic, and I had just got accepted into Fordham's PhD program for counseling psychology on Valentine's Day. And I remember that day, or 2 days before when we had the show, I was supposed to go to Indian Wells for the tennis tournament. I had all this stuff lined up, right? You guys were going to cover the NBA. I was going to cover ACCs, Olympics, Open, whatever else was going on. Nothing the rest of the year. And I actually don't remember anything about that 4 a.m. party that I was talking about, oddly. Like, that's how much of a blur it's been. I don't remember that party, but obviously it happened. But I think the craziest thing was being at the, what we deemed the epicenter of the pandemic in New York. And there was a period where I was like, my gosh, is there going to be food? Like, I had never experienced anything like that. There was no toilet paper. There was no pasta. Food was flying off the shelves. We didn't know what to do, where to go. We were stuck in a 1-bedroom apartment. So anyways,
water problems, right?
That's right. I forgot about that. Henry, your memory is amazing. I don't remember any of this.
Like, yeah, we don't have water right now. I was like, oh my God.
I forgot about that. Yeah. So that was a horrible recap of the year. I think because that year was just so clearly defined by that month and a half for me and some other personal stuff. There had been like a shooting right outside our building. It was like a couple days after the Kobe incident. Our dog was like seemingly potentially going to die from her cancer. And it was just like this crazy thing. But since then, we've all, I suppose, tried to find our sense of normalcy. We have moved from Manhattan. We ended up moving a couple months later. And then now I'm in the doctoral program full time and kind of like balancing the broadcasting stuff in the meantime. So that's, yeah.
You go into Fordham, or do you do everything on Zoom?
Everything's online at the moment, but it sounds like they just announced that they're probably going to operate full time starting in the fall. And so by my second year, we start doing a lot of practicum and field experience stuff. So that's when I'm going to start doing internships, and we have externships every single year. So that'll be really interesting to see how that all kind of, I'm not worried about the class part, but I think the internship and experience, like they've been using the telehealth aspect this whole time. And, there's a lot of like restrictions in terms of like confidentiality and what's appropriate, what's ethically appropriate to do all those things. But the government and federal government have lifted those standards to make sure that we are catering, because we are in an emergency situation and still kind of are. So a lot of people have been doing things virtually. And as we all know, like not everybody was equipped to handle this. The pandemic has been really interesting. I think it's accelerated a lot of things in people's lives and a lot of big decisions in various industries.
And your psychology efforts here are going to steer you back into sports is the idea, right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I think, when my whole decision of going back was my aim and my research and everything that I'm going to be doing is with the mind of athletes and trying to go back and help coaches and athletes. And my goal is to continue to kind of stay in sports it's kind of like a parallel move and progression as I'm getting my training as a mental health counselor and also as a counseling psychologist. I want to also to try to be able to help not just athletes of all ages and levels, but coaches and parents and all that other stuff too. So, like I was telling you earlier, but I plan to have my dissertation focus on athletes. I'm going to do my research apprenticeship and create a study on athletes, and probably having to do something with obviously like retirement and identity loss is a huge topic and passion for me. But I think one thing that I'm going to be interested in exploring right now is probably like the lifespan and the developmental stages that athletes go through. And I think by defining that, because no one has really done that yet, by defining that, I think that would give us a lot of intel and information about how to equip and coach and mentor athletes, not only like as they go through this progression through their career, but also prepare them for life after sports too.
Wait, this is like, David, you and I talked about this thing, like somebody used a line that I think about all the time, which is basically the secret to life is to figuring out what phase you're in and like kind of accepting that phase, right? So you're kind of talking about that for an athlete.
Yeah, I definitely am. And I think it's, I think it's applicable to, I think everybody could understand this. Athletes go through such a unique experience where, unlike any other industry or field, the closest one would probably be to maybe like child actors or performers or musicians, where they start their career around 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. By the time they're 18, 19, they could be potentially at the peak. And by the time they retire, they're either maybe in their 20s, if they're lucky, in their early 30s. And the general population does not do that. By 22 years old, they're just starting their careers and they're not retiring until 65 years old. So I think the most important thing is really just focusing on, I don't know if you guys have heard this, but this premature foreclosure of identity. So that happens a lot for a lot of these athletes and child performers, where at a time throughout childhood, you're supposed to be like exploring different social groups and interests and hobbies, but athletes and also performers don't necessarily do that. And so by the time they are 18, 25 years old, all they know is, I'm a basketball player, I'm a phenomenal athlete. But once that's gone, it's like, who are you as a person? And I know from firsthand experience, like sitting in a client chair with a therapist, like she was like, who is Prim beyond the accomplishments, beyond tennis? It was silence. Like I had no answer.
That word foreclosure is a big one. I'm like, that's when the sheriff comes and like puts a lock on it.
I'd be happy to have you talk to some of the guys that I coached over the years who are retired now. Like one of them was a very, very famous high school player, college champion, world champion in the NBA. Now he's coaching, but he's not playing anymore. I still think he misses it. And then another one retired in his early 30s. He had made $90 million. He was still getting offers to play. And he told me he loves real estate. He told me on the phone one day when his agent did not want him retired. You can understand why, because they wanted to make commission. But I knew he was done. And I knew he was done because he had told me on a phone call, Coach, I'm spending way more time on Zillow than Hoops Hype. I'm ready. He used to live on Hoops Hype because he loved the NBA, even though he was a great player. He loved all of the drama too. But he started loving real estate more. And that's exactly, he's a real estate mogul now and a father. He also had a baby the same year. And he said, you always told me, have a child and I'm ready to quit. I said, yeah, but I didn't mean when you were 32. He's like, I didn't know it would happen when I was 32, but I want to be home with my daughter. So he quit. And all he does is he just does real estate and is a dad. And, but there was a time when he just lived the game. So yeah, just be in touch with me off air and I'll hook you up with whoever you want.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, I love hearing those stories. I think like my whole goal is, I think everybody can achieve it. It's just a matter of like, are you gonna have to struggle for 5 years, or am I gonna be able to do some really good work and create this plan where it's like, I'm gonna reduce your struggle to maybe like 1 to 2 years. There's gonna be a huge transitional phase. But whatever I can do to create a plan to help athletes and also educate coaches and parents about that. And Coach Thorpe, I know you're exposed to a lot of that, and the parents that especially if we're talking basketball culture, like the emphasis AAU, that's a conversation that you could have forever about just like how the fundamentals and using life as a tool to teach kids about life in general, how to use sports as a vessel. It feels like that's kind of gone out the window too.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, Prim, when I left college, I was going to study. I got a job offer as a writer covering college football and pro football, or I was going to go to grad school for a degree in industrial/sports psychology, because it wasn't really sports psychology when I finished '87.
Yeah.
And then I met a super hot blonde and decided to chase after her, and it worked out fine. I married her, but I've always been deeply, deeply appreciative of what you guys and girls are learning to do. It's hard. Professional sports is really hard. Sports in general is really hard, but you brought up something very interesting. Two things. One is you talked about a plan, which is the single most common word I use when I talk to athletes, because most of them don't have a plan. And I don't mean just a mental health plan, no plan about much of anything, okay, except for what their coach told them to do, and they need to have more of a plan. But the parent thing, I think, is really intriguing, because they don't have a clue. And they don't even know they don't have a clue, which is why they don't have a clue. You talk to college coaches who are recruiting these great players, and I'll say that to them, and they'll say, you have never said anything smarter. The parents don't even know what to ask. They don't know what to expect of their child. When should they be upset? When are they supposed to push a little bit more? They need as much counseling as the players do. They really do.
They really do. It's an uphill battle. And then, with the spike of sports at the youth level, and just this overall emphasis on winning and the competitiveness, and also the specialization rather than, our generation or before, where it's playing multiple sports, and now you have an increase of burnout and also injuries at an earlier age. It's just this snowball effect that needs a lot of untangling. So
wait, do you, Prim, when you see like a 14-year-old who's killing it in any sport, but I guess tennis is a sport where that happens, and one well, do you identify with like the athlete as like, you gotta go kill it, or do you identify with the parent with like, oh, dial it back? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, that's a really good
you
question. Yeah, I think it's like picking both sides, because I think as an athlete, like there's nothing more special than being an athlete, because it gives you such a unique experience to engage in all these opportunities that most people don't get to engage in. So I would say both. I tell the athlete, like, make the most of it, but I also tell the parents, first and foremost, like, don't forget about your daughter, or your son, like, who are they as a person? Right. And I will always tell them, I was like, whether it's tennis or football or basketball, you can make that a priority, but there has to be a malleability, a flexibility with how the dynamics are kind of playing out in your family. So for example, like in my family, and especially with an Asian culture, and I mentioned the Asian culture because it's not abnormal for the family to send kids to a boarding school or academy, or decide on specialization at such a young age, right? And we see over in China, like, they'll figure it out. They'll even determine that the kid's going to be an Olympian before they're even born, But I think the most important thing is like, just having a sense of balance. So now we have a kid, Duke. So let's say, for example, he ends up playing soccer, and he loves soccer and all that other stuff. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that there's family time on the weekend. So there's a time to put sport away. Even if he wants to play 7 days a week, I'm going to force him not to, because I want to teach him the value of taking a break for his body and for his mind. I didn't know how to do that when I was like in my early 30s. And so I was like burning out, even when I was at ESPN. I didn't know how to take a break, and that's very important. So like as a family, go and explore music, have them take music classes, art, having philosophical questions about all those things. And I think those things are really important to kind of round out the identity of a child. And so you set the foundation of that they are somebody beyond just being an athlete.
So Judy put on the screen, in March 2019, Adam Silver, speaking at Sloan, said, "We are living in a time of anxiety." He had like specific stories of one-on-one conversations with famous NBA stars. He didn't give their names, basically saying a lot of these men are genuinely unhappy. He talked about social media and social isolation. He talked about like a superstar can land in a city on a private flight, with his teammates, but headphones on, go to the shoot around, go to the hotel, go to the game, get back on the plane, and not have a meaningful conversation with anyone the entire time. Here's where sports is, and then that was before the social isolation bomb went off in America, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does this mean from your point of view? Like, what does this mean? What is going on with sports and psychology here now?
Well, I mean, I would just kind of like pose a question back to you guys. Like, what is this life? How has the past year been for you guys, from a familial perspective, personal perspective, and also people's, very engaged in sports? What has it been like for you?
Never better.
You're a terrible.
We should just end. I'm like, that's not the answer I was looking for, Henry.
Where to begin, Prim? Where to begin? It's only an hour show. How can we possibly? Actually, there's one little wrinkle though. Like, honestly, David and I were just talking about, like, everybody we know is like not as sharp mentally, especially us, right? I've never been, just can't remember NBA players' names. David was talking about, he's been talking to players who don't remember plays from their most recent game, which has never happened before with David, right? Like, everybody would remember everything. It's just one little teaspoon of the oddities of the last year.
That is really interesting.
Yeah.
So what I was telling Henry, Prim, is I was talking to a player that I've been helping for a couple of years now, and he had a phenomenal month in the G League bubble. They just got upset in the playoffs, and right after the game, he called me, which has been the case for 2 years after every game, no matter where he's been. And this is the third time, I think, after the game in the last week, where I would bring up a pretty important play, and he just didn't remember what happened. And I said to him, this is a very, very serious professional player, an NBA level player who's been in the NBA before. I said, do you ever remember not remembering something after a conversation after any one of your games ever? And he laughed. He's like, definitely not. I said, yeah, there's something going on. I don't know if it's because you're playing so many games in so few days in this bubble. I said to Henry, maybe it's, and this is silly, but I was an athlete until, I got to be a college grad. After our big games, we would go have a beer and talk about the game. And maybe that helped me connect dots. And I still remember a lot of those plays. And of course, our memories aren't perfect, but they can't do that in the NBA. They're not going out drinking after games or just hanging out for dinner. They're going home. Same thing with these players in the G League bubble. I don't know what's going on, but I know this: something's happening, right? Something's happening.
Yeah, and so I mean that's a great piece and such a.
What did you remember when you played tennis? There's a lot of rallies, but did you tend to forget a certain rally point after the game?
You're asking the wrong person. Like LeBron James and
all of these guys remember every play.
Brady. No, they have like photographic memory. Honestly, maybe that's why I wasn't as good as we all thought we were gonna be. Because I would walk away from a match and be like, "Oh, was I up? I had match point? Like, really? I don't." Asking the wrong person. But I think the reason why I wanted to ask what your year has been like is because those are prime examples of whatever your personal experience are, just like a sliver, and it's not too different from what these athletes are going through. So, and then if we expand it to the general conversation of society, so the CDC and a bunch of also the people that I'm working with over at Fordham, a lot of people are doing a ton of research right now to try to figure out what is the state, what is the mental health state of our society and our country right now. And so the prevalence, I was trying to find out some information. So the CDC did a study, and the prevalence of symptoms of anxiety disorders was 3 times more compared to last year, just the year before. Suicidal ideations was 2 times greater compared to the year before. And the study was conducted, I think, around June of 2020. So, but just general mental health state in terms of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, even just like sexual assault and abuse in general, domestic abuse, everything is just on the rise. And why is like, is because our emotional expenditure right now, and the anxiety and stress that we are having to deal with, and also the isolation, which one of your audience members just talked about. I mean, you have this like confluence of factors that means that that's really going to affect your cognitive mental state. And so there's only so much that we can handle. So both of you guys, married, kids, all that stuff. So I don't know, when a woman gets pregnant, they call it like pregnancy brain, and also especially after she has a baby, literally you're like in pregnancy fog. And why is that? Well, not only because of the biological and physical stuff that you're going through, the hormonal stuff, but also just like the emotional state. It requires so much. And honestly, this is a traumatic period that we're going through. Like some of these, maybe not necessarily the athletes that are playing right now, but a lot of the young adults, maybe in college or whatever, they are now frontline workers, the essential workers trying to provide for their families. We have people that are getting sick and dying. You think about Karl Anthony Towns. I mean, what a traumatic situation and year it's been for him. But of course, it's not just Karl Anthony Towns, but the basketball community is a family, is it not? So, it's not just his teammates. I mean, these guys have been playing together since they were 7, 8, 10 years old. And so that is an extension of who they are too. So I think you add all these factors. I think they have to be, you have to really take everything into consideration. The isolation, the being confronted with a sense of mortality, that is something athletes are not prepared for, and some of these athletes getting sick and watching their bodies fall apart. That is not something that ever happens to an elite athlete. When your body falls apart, that is your vessel to success. And when it falls apart, and it's not too different when an athlete gets injured and they get really down and depressed. It's like, because especially for professional athletes, they've been able to prove all the naysayers wrong. And so once you fall apart, it's like, it's a shock.
There's I did an interview with a nutritionist a long time ago, and this is not what she said, but in my memory, as I've it's something like, so as a nutritionist, I'll be like, oh, you shouldn't eat pizza, before the game. It's not a good meal. And they're thinking I've been eating pizza before games since 5th grade, and I've been dunking over people like flying like a beautiful bird.
Yeah,
I'm to follow your pizza advice, right? But you get older and you can't eat the pizza. And,
yes,
it's hard to factor in limitations when your body's just solved problems.
I was watching the Pele documentary, which I highly recommend, on Netflix last night. And his first ever injury in his early 20s was in a World Cup game. Because of course the other team just brutalized him, as you can imagine, because he'd already won a World Cup when he was 18 or whatever. And he said on the show, what they did, basically, he's talking the whole time and it's just constantly translated. So you hear his cute little, he's much older now, voice in the background, and then he's translated in English the whole time. All of his teammates were doing it. And he said it was the first time he had been injured before. He's like, I was used to always being quicker, faster, stronger, and all of a sudden I'm crumpled over. He couldn't play.
Yeah.
And what they deal with that. This is something they deal with a lot. The other thing, Prim, as Henry knows, my son he plays at Florida State. In fact, if Duke wins tonight, they play Florida State tomorrow night in the ACC tournament. But when he's done, when the season's over, every class is virtual, so we can come home if he wants to for a week, whatever. And I said, what do you want to do? And he told his mom and all, nothing. I'm exhausted mentally. Of 150 tests. They test nonstop. And the fear of, he hasn't had it. And he would shut the entire season down, a top 20 team. And that anxiety is really, without question, impacted him. He was telling some of his teammates 2 weeks ago, he was like, guys, we can't do anything at this point. It's just stay at home, eat outside, that's it. because our season's in jeopardy if we get it now. We shut it
Yeah.
down. There's a lot of stress there. He said, I want to go home and do nothing. So I'll go outdoors and play hoops and be home, and that's it. Play hoops by himself. Don't even play with a friend. He's so worried about it. So that anxiety is hitting athletes everywhere, not just pros. The pros had it better. A lot of the other people, they have no mom, dad, sister. The pros have it easier that way.
I do agree with that. Yeah, my concern immediately went to, in the beginning, it was professional athletes and elite athletes. And then all of a sudden I realized I'm like totally excluding a whole demographic, and the people that don't have resources, which is college students and particularly high school students as well. And so we've seen a really big spike in depression, anxiety, suicidal ideations, attempts, just a lot of different issues that are really becoming a big issue within that population. Because the professional athletes, they have resources. So, you talk to a lot of them, and I spoke to like a CJ McCollum and a few other guys who are still active, and you have teams. I mean, some of them have a gym at home, and they have, the team sending them equipment, at home. And what, your dog didn't want to listen to the show? I'm offended.
He's a little finicky.
So I'm so offended.
He's a little finicky. It's not you.
Love the first half of the show.
Yeah.
One thing, Prim, I wanted to say to you also is you can bring such an important level of perspective to athletes and parents. I was speaking to a close friend of mine the other day who's got a 6'4", 6'5" sophomore son who's very good. He's being offered scholarships at solid Division I programs that are like top 20 in the country level. He's a sophomore. And they just got eliminated from the playoffs. And I said to the dad, how was the season? And he said, well, peaks and valleys. Now, this is a sophomore leading his team in scoring, one of the best players in the state. And I said to him, listen, most sophomores who are playing up don't have any peaks, all valleys. Like your son's getting scholarships. He led his team in scoring. He scored 30 points many times in a pandemic with all these things going on. He hasn't gotten sick. He didn't miss any games. Yeah. He scored all these points. You have to appreciate the peaks because most people don't have it. And this is a very bright man who had never thought about that. That simple thought of, in any context, much less the context we're going through this year, I need to take a step back and recognize how fortunate all these good things are. Yeah, some bad things are going to happen. That's life. Parents don't get that part. And athletes don't either. The first time an athlete fails, they think the sky is falling. Instead of recognizing, no, everyone else has been failing a lot more. You just kept bubbling up. But at some point, it catches up to you. You can't always be the best player on the team. There's only one of those guys.
Yeah. I think what's really tough and unique about this pandemic is that everybody is struggling in some capacity, whether you are young or older, single, married, working, not working. It's affecting everybody in just different ways. So, my single friends are having a different experience versus my married friends, kids, no kids, looking for job, changing careers. There's all these different things. And I think that there ends up for the quote unquote privilege. And I would put myself in that. I have a roof over my head. We are healthy. All those things are intact, but it's still been really difficult. And you feel this sense of guilt because you recognize that it has been one of the toughest years, and yet you should be appreciative for everything that you have. But within that same conversation, I want to tell people like it's relative. Like I get it that maybe our situations are better, but it's also, I don't want people to dismiss how difficult this year has really been. And I think that's just kind of like a message that I'm trying to send with everybody, because everybody always qualifies it. Like, well, we're okay. It's been hard, but we're okay. Well, I get that, but give yourself a little space to like really sit in through those tough emotions that you've been experiencing over the last year.
Oh, it's been awful. I'll own that. Yeah, for sure.
It's been so hard. Yeah.
So in the NBA, it was not that long ago, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, Jackie McMullen was excited. She came to me and told me that like Kevin Love had opened up that he was had experienced mental health challenges and got professional help for it and was willing to talk about it. This was like a new thing in the NBA. Mm-hmm. Like not 5 years ago. Now it's like by the time the NBA is opening the bubble, they're openly bragging about, there's like, I just looked it up. It's psychologist Derek Anderson was living in the bubble. And then Dr. Kenza Gunter was available remotely, I think over Zoom. So in a way, it's like we've come so far in this this thing you're describing. In a way, like we needed so much more. And I would, as proof, suggest like the players refused to go back into another bubble this year. The anecdotes as to why were, mental health related, right? It was just awful to be in that level of isolation. You and I talked about this briefly this morning, and you then talked about some interesting stuff about sports psychology, which is usually presented as kind of the solution here, is not the same as other kinds of psychology, right? Can you walk a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's one thing that I've really had to educate myself on, that because you just assume psychology is psychology. And I've worked with sports psychologists before, and you just assume like, oh, they should be able to help us with a lot of things. But there are a lot of pretty vast differences. And a lot of those differences have to do with the training and then what you are credentialed and equipped to handle. So essentially sports performance, sports psychologists, and performance experts, they can fall into one category, and all of them are equipped to handle the performance aspects, typically just like everything that happens on the court or field, they're equipped to handle some of those things. So trying to get in the zone, that's their sweet spot, and that's what they're trying to do. And of course they can help. There's always going to be intersection with the personal life, so they can help with a lot of those things. But if they are solely trained on sports psychology, they may not, and most likely will not be trained to handle mental health issues. So, he's back. He's back. I feel like this is a good conversation. This is a good one to join at this point, in my opinion, because honestly, everybody needs to be educated on it, including dogs and cats. But the mental health counselors and counseling psychologists, they are trained to handle much more severe psychopathology. So depression, anxiety, childhood trauma, eating disorders, body image, relationship issues, all those things. So they are very, very much trained to handle that. And so I think, I was I was doing a project on something. And so I was looking up some of the recent shifts over the past 5 years about what professional leagues and teams are trying to do. And so within the same scope of talking about the increase in awareness of mental health, they would point out some of the things that the NFL is doing, or that the MLB, 28 out of 30 teams now have a sports psychologist on staff. And so that made me pause, because I'm like, that's great, but are those sports psychologists trained and credentialed and equipped to handle if a player is dealing with some really severe issues such as depression, anxiety, all that other stuff? And so I think that's just the biggest difference. And so you and I were talking, I think the thing that's really important right now, I was reading an article and they had a really good point about both sides need to work together and make sure. So on one hand, the sports psychologists, and some of them are trained. I believe the gentleman you were talking about, he's with the Marlins, and also, so I think he's trained. He got his PsyD, and he's also trained from a clinical perspective. So it sounds like he has some of that training. But for those that don't, they can at least expand some of their education and all that other stuff, and work to be able to work with counseling psychologists or psychiatrists or mental health professionals, and work with them from that end. And then on this side, on the counseling psychology and mental health side, who are now being hired by teams, they now need to be trained about sports culture, because as we all know, it's a very specific language, and there are things that are just very different from normal society, and things that athletes are going to be confronted with that the general population isn't. So there has to be just kind of like a blend, and more cooperation from both sides, and also just really just more education to the teams and the coaches about what those differences are.
Who's doing it well?
I like what the NBA is doing right now. I think a lot of that, I think the NBA in general, the NBA in conjunction with the NBPA, as we've seen with the launch of their mental health program, I think it was around 2018 and 2019, they've done a really good job. I think they're probably one of the more progressive leagues compared to all the other sports. I like what the NBPA is doing. They hired Dr. William Parham, him and his brother are both tremendous pioneers in the field of sports psychology and counseling psychology. And so, since then, Dr. William Parham has done a really good job about like trying to establish this mental health program that is accessible for all the players and trying to destigmatize the concept of mental health. Adam Silver, I think he's done a really good job. And, if I'm being honest, I think one of the if I were to pinpoint a league that's really there's going to be some pressure on them to make some progress, but I think the culture makes it really difficult. Is maybe a place like the National Football League, where there's a lot of the rules and the culture that they continue to engage in are still very much based on archaic, arcane, traditional ideals. So, but yeah, I think the NBA is doing a really good job.
That's good to hear. I read this around January 1st. Jason Quick published a story in The Athletic about Nasir Little, who's a supporting player of the Portland Trailblazers, but he had very serious COVID. And I thought of it when we were talking this morning, because I wonder if I can find, here we go. What happened over the next 22 days was a personal hell that Little says he wouldn't wish on anybody. He couldn't eat, he couldn't drink, he couldn't watch television because of splitting headaches. From the December 1st diagnosis until his first negative test on December 22nd, he lost 20 pounds. I'm not trying to sound morbid or anything, but it was to the point where it was like, you just don't want to feel anything, Little said. It was really that bad. You just wished it would stop. It was consistent 24/7, just miserable pain. My back was hurting so bad. My headaches were terrible. I couldn't eat anything. He'd awake mornings with soaked sheets from night sweats. He would try to nourish with smoothies, but kept throwing them up. He lost his sense of taste and smell, and the headaches would never subside. It just struck me like, oh, not time for a sports psychologist.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, kind of, are you asking me to read between the lines or trying to untangle this situation? I mean, yeah, I mean, it's one of those, it sounds very serious. He was no doubt going through a really tough time. And I think what's really important to consider is that anytime, an athlete goes through something very severe, I think we have a tendency to have a very immediate focus. It's like, what's the event? We want to pinpoint like what caused this, right? And we want to choose one thing because that just makes life easier to figure out. It's like, what causes? But unfortunately, psychology, and what makes it so complicated is that the history goes all the way back. So it's like, I look at his concussion, there's a lot of things with any sort of a concussion or traumatic brain injury or whatever. I mean, it can cause a lot of things. And the fact that he rushed back, that's another kind of like factor that's going on. The isolation, the pandemic, the fact that he's a young star still trying to prove himself. And the moment he tries, he feels like he's on his feet and really about to make 2 steps forward, 5 steps forward, and then something always happens. Like all those factors really play into that. And so, whether or not how down he was, whether or not he was experiencing some sort of mental health, what kind of mental health issue he was experiencing. I mean, no one would really know. That's only for him to know and really untangle. He would have to speak with a psychologist, maybe do an assessment or whatever. But I think it happens. I think it's possible that anybody could experience some form of depression. You don't have to have depression, but you can have depressive like symptoms for a 3-week period, especially if you're going through something really difficult, severe, and or traumatic. And also, especially if you're thinking about just life in general. I think the concept of mortality is something that we've all been confronted with over the last year in a way that we've never been exposed to. That changes everybody's perspective. Like people are.
It's a big year for death. Yeah, big year for death for sure. Yeah.
Right? Because it makes you think about your legacy and it makes you reflect on your life. Like, what am I really doing? How much time do I have left? What does my family life look like? What am I doing with my basketball career? Is it enough? Am I going to have enough time? And all those like existential questions, I think, are really tough to deal with, especially if you're, only 20 years old?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Well, there's and I think we know that sort of part of treating players in a fuller, more human way, right, is encouraging vulnerability, right? And so here's a guy saying that to me, alarm bells went off when he said, "You just don't want to feel anything." That's like a woo kind of. So he's saying this to a sports writer, and now it's a few months later, and he's shooting 50% from three, and he's hammer dunking on people, and it's very tempting to be like, "Woo! Thank God that's all over with," right? Where it's like, I don't know that we have any reason to believe that, right? Like for all the reasons you outlined, it's this bigger, longer concern, and not that I need necessarily little to lay down on my couch and talk to me about it, but I do feel kind of like aware that like, oh, this is a struggle, right? There's a lot going on here, and this is not easy, and this sport is hard, and we know only a little tiny piece of it from watching it on TV.
Yeah, and I'd be curious. I'd be curious about, because you guys are very tapped into the basketball world. I'd be curious what fans are saying and what the reception is. Do you think people are starting to care more for not just the athlete, but also the person behind that? Are they starting to care a little bit more about just their general well-being, or what's the dialogue?
What do you think, David?
I would say this won't be sounding smart at all. This is probably common sense to you both. Those that did prior to the pandemic still do, and those that don't probably still don't.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the percentage is. That's not my area of expertise. But I do want to bring up something on this topic that goes back to something Henry and I dealt with a long time ago. So Prim, you've talked about dealing with injuries, and there's also anxiety regarding how you're performing. One of the things that makes athletes unique, besides the genetic advantages that many of them have, or the work ethic, and you can argue what talent really is. It's not just because you're 7 feet tall. Kevin Durant wasn't born this player. Like, he worked relentlessly. Okay, so we're acknowledging all of that. There is a bravado, there is a swagger to being a pro athlete you must have to perform, not because of the lights. It's just hard to beat the other dude that wants to beat you, right?
Mm-hmm.
The dudes in a team sport. And going back to when Miami first lost to Dallas in a shocking fashion in whatever 2010-11 season, maybe LeBron's first year, we did a true TV back then where I said to Henry, with my amateur degree as a bachelor in psychology is all I have, I said LeBron needs to seek counseling. He was so bad, and he's the best player in the world. And at that point, we didn't think he'd be the best of all time. We knew it was possible, not after what just happened. And years later, he admitted that he did. And so what I think is interesting is when you talk about the NBA being more progressive on this front, I'll be happy when they really start not just making them available, but advising them, talk to someone. After we go through all of this, whenever it's the right thing to do, and more players, LeBron won't say they'll take the vaccine or not. There's issues there. But having people like CJ and Kevin Love, who are great players, talk about their issues, we need more of that. So athletes go literally take the direct move of finding someone like yourself with the degrees that is required in the experience to make sure they're okay going forward. They need to do that. Otherwise, they'll be caught in a downward spiral, and it's hard to catch up from there. The snowball starts rolling, it's hard to stop it and get it back uphill.
Yeah, I won't disagree with that. I definitely agree with that. I think the part of me that was saying, hey, I think the NBA is doing a really good job, that was me trying to make up because for all the other stuff that I hope didn't sound too negative and sad and depressing. And I was trying to provide a sliver of hope and positivity. But if I was to be totally transparent, I mean, I wouldn't be going back to school for another 5 more years if I didn't think that there was somebody that needed this type of resource.
Sure.
The whole reason why I'm changing my whole life is because I was like, my gosh, if there are people, there's so few people that understand the intersectionality of mental health and who these people are and how they perform as athletes. And it all matters. So yeah, I do think that there's a long way to go. And a lot of that has to do with just this culture, the sports culture that emphasizes these hyper masculine ideals, which I'm not saying is necessarily bad because I engaged in it. There's this sense of like, you can't be weak. You've got to be strong and powerful and confident and carry yourself a certain way. And for females, it means carrying yourself almost in a tomboy, androgynous way as well. The suppression of emotions and all those things. But it's that type of culture that lends itself to issues once sport is no longer there. So that's why you have this like confluence of factors where of course it makes sense that athletes are going to struggle to get help because they've been taught their whole lives since they were 6 years old. Don't cry, don't whine, don't complain, don't talk about it, injury, like suck it up and play through it.
And then honestly, next man up. How crazy is that? Yeah. Right? Like, this guy died over here, but you just go ahead and do your job. Like, what? Like, if we want this guy to feel comfortable expressing vulnerability, like, we cannot say next man up. We just can't. Like, that's so bananas. Like,
literally, that phrase comes from battle.
I know. And we're telling, I mean, did you hear that kind of stuff from when you were playing tennis and you were 14 or whatever? Like, did these people talk?
Yes. The stories,
Tell us one. Can you tell us one story?
Gosh, I don't know which, like anecdotally or my own personal story.
Yeah, yours.
Yeah, I mean, just like the little things. I mean, I remember my first tournament where even just like the thought of losing, much less like being injured or showing any weakness. When I was 9 years old, it was my very first tournament. And then this is ingrained in my head. And my coach, who was Chilean, and made us train 8 hours a day, literally from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m., 1 hour break, 1 to 5 p.m. When I was 7, 8 years old. And so my first tournament, I was up 3-love against the first seed. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, this is terrifying. I'm not supposed to be beating. And like, can I handle this success? And it was my first tournament at 9 years old. And so I lost. And my coach was like, you were up. Like, you were so, like, you did okay. But you lost. And you lost. You lost. And you lost. And you lost. And you lost. And you lost. Literally, he said that. He's like, but you lost. And I'm holding it back because it's so embarrassing to do what he actually did, which is like literally berate me for 20 minutes just about, but you lost. So, I mean, that's just like a small description. Now imagine if we get to the elite level and somebody has an injury, like you hear all these stories. And, I think like once you're in the circle, everybody becomes friends. So I have a lot of friends in football and basketball, and you hear everybody just saying like, our doctors, like, they just shoot us up. And like, I don't even know what these pills were and what these shots were, but everybody calls it like the booty shot. Like, what is that, But there is just this sense of like, suck it up and deal with it. And listen, like, I engaged with it. So I understand the culture. When I was making that ridiculous comeback or midlife crisis 5 years ago.
Pre-midlife.
Hey, let's be honest.
Well, that seems a little harsh.
After my ESPN days, and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna play. So I took the summer to play, and I knew my shoulder, because I had already had shoulder surgery. I was like, I knew this is not gonna last. So I went to the doctor. I was like, listen, I've had shoulder surgery before. I know what it feels like. I'm going towards that. I just need to play for 3 more weeks. So send me to the chiropractor and shoot me out with, a couple cortisone shots. And so that is, and that's not necessarily, I'm not trying to accuse the doctors of malpractice or anything, but I'm just saying like that is the culture, because that we, including myself, have all engaged and perpetuated. But those are the things that cause issues when it comes to mental health, though.
Yeah. Drod, I think you want to get on this. I'm pretty sure. Just noticing in the chat, Drod was using some all caps.
I was just Drod's coming on. I'm launching a player development app, and I told my developers out in California, we're just creating a really cool curriculum with my voice and my videos, but not an ability to help parents, because they're not going to send their kid to a sports psychologist unless they're already performing at elite level. The only way the kid the young man or woman has a chance to fall in love with the sport, which is the only thing I want, is if their parents help. And so if we can't create a way for me to dialogue with them, especially with scale, because we're trying to get more than a few people, it's not worth it, because all we're doing is getting kids to go on the court and do a million things. Then they get yelled at by their coach, their parents. Parents don't know any better. Let's teach them how to create the environment, the culture where their kids can gain from sports what's most important, which isn't necessarily a professional career. It's just a better life and a lot of lessons learned in a way harmlessly. That's what we should be trying to do. And parents don't know any better. They don't know how to do it. You got to teach them how to do it. Hey, Drod.
Hey, Joe. Drod is youth sports, and I think has probably yelled at children before. Is that correct?
Yeah, but his guys are in the water. They can't even hear him.
Hello, Prim.
Hey.
Actually, Coach, sound travels quite well over water, so they can certainly hear me. And I'm sure, no doubt, I've definitely raised my voice at athletes numerous times in a variety of situations, as have you. Like but
Oh yeah.
What's interesting to me, and Prim, I love what you're doing, is this idea of changing the culture. But what we're doing is this language is evolving, right? Like, so on the one hand, okay, we got these NBA guys and we want them to be comfortable about admitting vulnerability. But as for all the eloquent reasons you all laid out, sports does not, as it's in its current state, does not make that a comfortable place. Even look so far as Paul George, right? Who literally said this year, after I said what I said about the bubble and struggling, guys now this current season are coming at me and saying things in a different way, because that's still the mindset. And we've all been close enough to courtside to know what dudes say when you say things like that, or we've been in games and we know what they say, right? Like, so you have that one end. But on your point, Prim, I love like starting like the idea of the difference between performance therapy and actual therapeutic for life, right? Like, and changing that from the young ages, so that by the time, if they're good enough, they get to the pro level, this is indoctrinated as part of the culture. But to Coach's point, you've got to teach coaches, parents, referee, like everybody involved in this whole system has to be on board, or else it's just going to be like a little, a little here, a little here, a little here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Has anybody else had the experience of noticing that WNBA players seem to talk about this in a vastly healthier way than NBA players?
Oh, for sure.
Every time Sue Bird talks, I'm like, oh, just do what she says.
But that is really interesting, and that's something that I'm gonna that's something that I'm exploring right now, because I think I made them recently. Up until recently, I was doing something on an assignment on intersectionality, which I don't know if you guys know, but it's basically like talking about the different multiple identities of yourself. So for me, it is a female. For me, it is also an athlete, but it is also, as a second generation Thai American, it is also, being a petite woman, being a mother, all those different things play into it. And I think what is really important to kind of consider with those, like all those different factors kind of get dismissed, and we don't want to kind of bunch all athletes into one group, because I think female athletes do have a different experience. A lot of that has to do with the culture of what guys and girls are taught, what our society tells us about what is really important. So, like for young females, it's like, hey, be sweet and nice and kind, be a good student, be obedient, all these other things. And for a male, it's like, hey, engaging in sports, whether you play in it, whether you talk about it, whether you're dogging and trash talking about the Yankees last night, talking about who balled last night, like those things really matter. And so that is not to say that female athletes don't struggle as much, because I definitely struggled when I retired. But I do think that in some ways, like female athletes are a little bit more well-rounded and equipped. And I think a lot of that has to do with just like what societal ideals are. It's just starting to change over the past, I would say 15 years, where it is like we're being accepting of females playing sports as a career. Like for me, when I graduated from school in 2003, that still wasn't even a thing. Like people are like, oh, well, unless you're like number one in the world by the time you're 22 years old, like your chances are kind of gone. And what are you going to do? Like, until 25, 27. But look at what's happening now. I mean, we have players all the way up until Serena Williams is, 39 years old. So, it's just kind of interesting to talk about all those different factors.
And I wonder if there's like coping is a key skill here, right? And it means a lot of things, but like just there's like a little bit of social media from the Wubble, and there's a bunch of children. I'm like, okay, so let's think about this day, right? Like, how do you be a championship winning WNBA player while caring for making that fun for a child, right? Like, this is a 20-hour day, right? Like this is like, and it was like inconceivable that, that Paul George would have a child in the bubble because he's too busy or something. I guess, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I don't know exactly what the math is there, but like, of course there would be no children in the men's bubble, right? Like unthinkable. Like, okay.
He referenced that in that article we wrote. Actually, you know what? We haven't published it yet.
Oh,
I have a thing about Paul George in there, and one of the things that caused him anxiety is he didn't get to see his kids.
Well, he didn't have his kids. He didn't get to see his kids, but he also didn't have to care for his kids, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
like in the Wubble, it's like if you have your kid in there, you have your kid all day. There's no way Paul George can cope with that. I'm sorry. Like, I mean, I don't know Paul George, but it seems unlikely. But to me, like, but perhaps in that, which is, you know, which is more commonly an everyday burden of women, like, I think maybe this is why WNBA players in part sound stronger, is because there's just more coping skills, right? Like,
Yeah.
really asked to do more things. Like, more of the day is like, fuck, we got to deal with this. Okay, like, let's do it.
It is really interesting to think about like the different experiences of a professional athlete and the difference between a male athlete and female athlete. And also we have to think about the differences between sports, because football and soccer and tennis and basketball, they all have their own demands and thus require different things. But yeah, I mean, and I hope I didn't make it sound in a way that female athletes are put in a better position. I think it's harder than ever before to be a woman just in general, because you know, now we're being asked to be independent, financially stable, not only have a job, have a successful career, look good, look young, be an athlete, be fit, have a mom, be a mom, have kids, like do all these things. Like that was never asked for in past generations. And there's more pressures and more than ever before on women.
Judy in the chat says, all caps, amen, 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 amen.
Yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of stats in terms of just like the general stress levels for women is, you know, out the roof compared to past generations.
What do we do about that?
That's a really good
4
question.
minutes left, Prim, you got this.
You
4
said no
minutes and I have
quizzes,
4
Henry.
minutes to save the whole race, like and gender and
I think you got it.
I don't really know. You know
Caleb
what?
recommends dismantling the patriarchy. That would be a great first step.
That would be it's a big step, but it's a really important one. You know what? Just like as we're like closing, I think the pandemic, just like we use sports where a really bad mistake or loss, and it's all about like the champions always know how to way to reframe it and learn something from it. And so if we're applying this to life, I think the pandemic is such a huge opportunity to reflect on how bad it was, but what we can do better to enhance our lives. And I think a lot of it we've learned is balance. So, and finding ways and using technology and all the resources that we have to create balance. So if we're talking about like typical American culture, where the harder you work and the more you work, the better you are and the more successful you are, like, what if we like just like deconstruct that and say, maybe we should adopt a more work-life balance and companies are talking about that right now. My husband in his field, they're talking about right now where it's like, we're going to go virtual, maybe from here on out, less travel, have people come in 3 days a week, work from home 1 to 2 days, and having that balance. I think there's a lot of things that we could take from this past year and apply it to the future and creating a better life for not only for us, but for future generations too. I felt like that was like a very cliche United Way kind of commercial. I don't know. Was that
No,
the word?
I like it.
What you were really saying is death to the capitalist machine, which is always agreed upon in this particular show.
I mean, look at when the pandemic hit, the unemployment really just hit one gender.
Yeah.
Right. When you saw that almost everyone that lost their jobs were women. Okay. Why? Because they went home to be with the kids.
Yeah.
Right. That's what you're suggesting opens up lots of other opportunities if they did that. Yeah. If they followed your lead. You and Gerard, look into it. You guys can do this.
We got it, Prim. No problem.
If it got
Change
a
the
little
world.
broad, Judy can make it specific. She's also recommending do a load of laundry every now and then. Let's start there, damn it.
Judy, that
sounds very personal, Judy. Very personal.
Yes, empower the proletariat, Caleb. You said the magic word proletariat. You know what's going to happen now. Look out.
Now we get audited or something. It's all
It applies everywhere. Oh my god.
Okay, I think we clarified some things there, unmuddied the waters of like how to solve, sports, life, everything. Prem, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks for having me on, guys. It was such a blast. It was so good to see all of you. I'm glad everyone's doing well and healthy.